Categories 5. Potential each 20. Total potential 100. Sins 13. Welcome to Rotted Review of the Day. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the 2014 Daniel Stamm movie 13 Sins. This is a movie that has been done before, at least the basic premise of it, and I think has been done better. However, I can't think of any instances in the world of horror where it has been done better. This is a movie that it straddles that line, and it's a long debated question, especially amongst my friends and I, and just generally the entire world, especially with horror fans, is at what point, where is the line between suspense and horror? I would argue that Seven is a suspense movie. I would argue that Saw is a horror movie. Both of them involve serial killers. Both of them involve a self-righteous, moral equivalent, attempting to teach lessons kind of thing. Both of them are a cat and mouse game between detectives. At what point is that line drawn? And it's not so much a line as it is this really fuzzy gray area. And for 13 Sins, I would say that it lends itself less towards ash gray and more towards charcoal. I think it's definitely on the horror side, whereas if you take a superior movie, in my opinion, which is Michael Douglas's The Game from the 1990s, I think that was definitely more a suspense movie. Even though it was better done, I don't think of it as a horror movie at all. So that's a long debate, and I think it's one that is ultimately going to just wind up being the opinion of, it's not going to be a factual, well, this is how it is. It's just going to always be a gray area opinion. Depends on who's talking about it kind of thing. Regardless, the premise of this movie is a young man who is struggling financially, struggling socially, struggling psychologically. He has a brother to take care of who has disabilities. He has a father who's a burden on him financially and emotionally. And he's also trying to get married. He is down on his luck in pretty much every way, and he receives a mysterious phone call on his cell phone offering him the ability to earn a ton of money through a series of escalating tasks, the first of which being, you're in your car, there's a fly in the car, kill the fly. And he does, and congratulations, there is now this amount of money in your bank account, and check for yourself if you don't believe us. And the next task would be kill the fly, or eat the fly rather, that you just killed. And it goes on from there. This is a spoiler-free review. I really don't want to get any past the first two sins with being a spoiler-free review. We're going to have a spoiler-filled deep dive discussion video that'll accompany this one, where I'm going to be talking about the kind of nature of the antagonist and just the general role of somebody in this position and doing the cat and mouse thing with the character. And obviously I'll be going through more sins than just the first two in that video, but this one is spoiler-free. It's safe. So let's just go ahead and put this one right through the meat grinder, and 5 different categories, each category worth up to 20 points for a total possible score of 100 points. And the first category is plot and subtext. And the plot on this one I thought was fairly straightforward. You had this character, and he was being put through these steps and being put through emotional and psychological and physical trauma at each step, and essentially changing who he is fundamentally as a person, but struggling against that change, because that's the nature of this cat and mouse game, is changing fundamentally who he is. And I thought it held together pretty well. There were parts of it that I think struggled with the believability portion, and there were parts of it that I'm going to be discussing in the deep dive as far as the difficulties in properly and realistically crafting a movie like this, where it is a largely unseen presence that is pulling the strings. I mean, the poster even shows, the character on puppet strings of a character like this. And I think it has its inherent issues in writing and in plot development, and I mean, not just issues, but landmines that you have to avoid. And I think that this movie did a fairly decent job of avoiding them, but there were a few it stepped on that broke the immersion and broke the reality of it for me. So I went ahead and I gave this 13 out of 20 points. The intent, I think, followed the plot fairly well. It was intended to be a suspenseful movie with horrific elements to it, with more of the Saw, dirty toilet, torture porn kind of thing, and I think it achieved it fairly well, but the movie relied on a sense of believability that, like I said, in the plot category there, it did break for me every once in a while. I gave this one a 13 out of 20 as well. The acting. This is an element of the movie that I am guilty of this, and I refuse to change, and I refuse to apologize for it. If I see a movie that has a somewhat low budget, a completely unheard of cast, you see the first 4 names there, and I've never heard of them before, and then the 5th name is somebody that I recognize and I love. Lance Henriksen, Bruce Campbell, in this case, Ron Perlman. I gotta watch it. And usually it's just that person in one scene for 5 minutes of the movie, and that's it. We got our hands on this actor. We can commit to him for a day of shooting, and then they do. But I still I stand by my methodology. And Ron Perlman, I thought, did a fairly decent job in this. Again, his role was pretty limited. Really, what it comes down to is the actor Mark Webber. He was the one running the show, and I thought he did a fairly decent job of it. I gave this 14 out of 20. The limits of believability when they got stretched, I think, were... I don't know if they could have been handled better, and I don't know if that's more of a directional thing or an acting thing, but essentially what wound up being on the film and beamed into my eyeballs, I thought could have been a little bit better. So 14 out of 20, fairly decent job, especially for basically one guy running things. The technical portions, I thought, were probably one of the better parts of this. I gave that a 15 out of 20. The effects were very good. The way that things were filmed to keep the audience in suspense and keep them guessing as to what's going on, I think was fairly decent. Everything about what it showed you and what it didn't show you with very purposeful manipulation was very, very good. So 15 out of 20 for that. And the fear quotient, I think, is ultimately where the movie falls down the most, just because even though it was more horror than suspense for me, it never really scared me. And this is where the area gets gray, is I have had suspense movies scare me more than this movie, but I still categorize it as horror. And I think the reason for that is just the focus on this movie focused less on the suspense of what the character was going through and more on the horrific elements of what was happening. If this movie had played less towards the blood and gore and less towards the... if it had more to do with... without giving any sins away, say, for instance... and this is not a sin that occurred within the movie, but I'm just trying to give an example that is not a spoiler, but still meets what I'm trying to convey here. If it was less, hey, we have this random stranger here, I want you to diabolically cut off their fingers one by one. And it was more along the lines of, we have this person that you care about, and we want you to hurt them in an emotional way, which it did have some elements of that. I'm kind of coming off a little bit of the rails here, but I really do stand by the fact that this is more horror than suspense. Even so, there wasn't a whole lot scary about it. It did have more blood and guts and those kind of effects and that terrible nature to it, which we love as horror fans, and less of the psychological manipulation of the audience. And the fear, I think, came from suspenseful moments more. I think, how to put this? I think the fear quotient would have been elevated a lot more if it had and I'm not an advocate for jump scares, but I think that they would have been more fitting in a movie like this. This relied on suspense in a movie that wasn't focused on suspense. That's the best way to put it. The fear came from suspense in a movie that wasn't focused on suspense. It had horrific elements to it, and that's where the focus was. But those moments weren't elevating the fear level at all. So I do categorize this as horror, but I also say that it didn't scare me as much as a horror movie should, and as much as a suspense movie has in the past. So I gave this a fear quotient of 8. Overall, decent. The blood and gore effects and the way that the camera stayed on them and so forth, it did, it raised that knot in the stomach and like, oh god, I can't look kind of thing. It had some elements of that, but I think it could have been a lot scarier, a lot better. So, total score of 63 points. I really want to discuss, like I said, in the deep dive discussion, I want to discuss the nature of this kind of cat and mouse movie and the pitfalls that inherently come with it, as well as some more details about this movie in particular and the ending of it and some of the more particular sins to it. So that should about do it for this one. I think I would ultimately just land on the notion that I would recommend this movie to people. I would not say that it is a great movie, and I would not say that it is a great horror movie or a great suspense movie, if you want to categorize it that way, but I would still recommend it to people if they came to me and asked, what would be a good psychological mess with me kind of movie. I would probably think of 13 Sins, somewhere in my list, and toss that out there. So take that for what you will, and next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.